Hello again. Today I want to give you a little bit of about how to read the story of Adam and Eve, and also the story of Abraham in the book of Genesis. A little bit of background. Um, First thing about the creation story is I think it's a mistake to take it too literally. I mean, the tree of life, the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, um, the eating the fruit of which is what gets Adam and Eve in trouble. Can you go to the grocery store and buy the fruit of of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil? I mean, that begs to be taken as a metaphor. The location of Eden uh, talks about there being a river flowing out of Eden, and it becomes the source of four rivers. The first one, Pishon, looks like it has to be. Uh, uh, it isn't clear what that is. Um, that looks like it's in Arabia somewhere, might even refer to the Arabian Sea. The second one is called Gihon, which is the name of a spring in Jerusalem, but it says that river flows through the whole land of Cush. Cush was the ancient name of what we today call Sudan. And so that river has to be the Nile that rises in East Africa and flows north, um, emptying into the Mediterranean on the northern coast of Egypt. The third river is Hiddekel, which today is called the Tigris. The fourth is the Euphrates. Both the Tigris and Euphrates begin in what is today Turkey and flow southeastward and empty into the Persian Gulf in Kuwait. Now, the point here is this: there is not and never has been a place on earth where the Nile, the Tigris, and the Euphrates rivers all meet. This is begging to be taken symbolically. The Adam and Eve story is an everyman story. We're all Adam and Eve. And if you'll read it that way, I think it makes a lot more sense. And that's not a new idea that I've come up with. When we get to early Christianity later in the semester, you're going to read an early Christian philosopher named Origen in the 2 and 300s AD, who suggests that some things in the Bible don't have a literal sense that makes sense, that needs to be read allegorically. In this story, after you get the creation of Eve, in Genesis 3, we get the temptation and what's called the fall. Notice there's only one rule, and they break it. Aren't we like that? As soon as you tell us you cannot do that, we want to do it. I remember when I was in junior high many, many moons ago, the dress code for male students in Orange County, Florida, said that we had to wear socks. Now, we mostly wore leather shoes back then, so frankly, to wear them without socks was uncomfortable. And had there not been a rule that said we had to wear socks, it would probably never have occurred to us not to wear socks. But the very fact that there was a rule said to what were then 7th, 8th, 9th grade guys, that made it cool to not wear socks. Now, you'd carry a pair of socks rolled up in your pants pocket in case you got caught, because it's very uncool to be sent home to get properly dressed. The assistant principal, who we thought was at least 200 years old, prowled the halls during class changes looking at guys' ankles, and because that's also the age where you start developing interest in people whose bodies differ from yours in specific ways. We attributed that to some weird kind of foot fetish. Looking back, she was probably about the age that I am now. The stores even got in on it and started selling socks in the colors that human skin comes in. The whole thing was stupid on both sides. But isn't that the way we are? Soon as there's a rule, we don't want to follow it. Now, what happens when they eat that fruit? They realize that they're naked. I think there's a symbolism there too. Yes, they were physically naked, but they become ashamed. They've been naked all along, but they weren't ashamed. You ever been around a little kid? Do they care who changes their diaper? I think every 2-year-old who has ever lived has gone streaking. And so they want to cover up. Isn't that the way we are? As we mature, we become aware of things about us that we want to hide, and not just parts of our body, but we think that if people knew that we did that, or that we thought that way, that we felt that way, that they wouldn't like us, and so we hide, we cover up. And that's what they do. And there's a joke that we don't get unless you happen to have had a fig tree in your yard growing up. Fig leaves would be just about the worst kind of leaf possible to make clothes out of, because they are scratchy. It'd be like making clothes out of sandpaper. I think the rabbis who told this story, that's kind of a joke on Adam and Eve as they tell about making clothes out of fig leaves. And then you get this wonderful anthropomorphic story about God walking in the garden in the cool of the evening. If you have to do anything in the summertime around here, you want to do it early in the morning or late in the evening, right? Because it's hot. And so he comes walking in the garden in the cool of the evening, and Adam and Eve are nowhere to be found, and so he calls out to them, "Where are you?" And Adam says, "I heard you walking in the garden, and I was naked, so I hid." And God says, "Who told you that you were naked? Did you eat the fruit of that tree I told you not to eat?" Now, have you ever been part of a conversation like that, where mom says, "Did you do thus and so that I told you not to do?" I've been on both sides of that conversation. Now, when mom asks you that, did Mom ask because she didn't know whether you'd done it or not? Or did she ask knowing full well you had done it and just wanted to see if you would tell the truth or if you would lie? And of course, Adam blames Eve. And isn't this the way we are? Adam says, hey, that woman you gave me, it's her fault, and it's your fault for giving her to me. And Eve, of course, blames the snake. I mean, isn't this, again, the way we all are? We want to blame somebody else, anybody but us, for our mess-ups. It's always somebody else's fault. Now, because this is a story that kind of explains how things got to be the way they are, it explains why the snake has this unusual way of getting around that kind of gives us the willies when we watch it. It's fascinating, but yet it's kind of unsettling the way that a snake moves without legs, and explaining why people and snakes don't get along. By the way, in the United States, 75% of the people who were bitten by venomous snakes were all engaged in the same activity. What do you think that might have been? No, not camping, not hunting, not even walking in the woods. They were trying to kill the snake. Newsflash. The snake does not want you to kill it. And it tries to protect itself the only way it knows how. Moral of the story: leave the damn thing alone. And it explains why it is that women have pain in childbirth and yet want to have kids. It is the weirdest thing. Oh. And guys, it explains why we have to work for a living when everybody knows that what we really want to do is to sit on the couch in our underwear watching sports on TV. But because they ate the fruit they weren't supposed to eat, they lose access to the garden and to the tree of life that would keep them young and alive forever. And so human beings become mortal and die. In Genesis 4, we get the famous Cain and Abel story. Some scholars see this as evidence of conflict between farmers and herders, and God accepts Abel's offering from his herd and not Cain's from the ground. But it's definitely about sibling rivalry. How many of you have brothers and sisters? How many of you ever fought with your brothers and sisters? Again, isn't this the way we are? It's about how siblings fight. And then I went from there to the story about Abraham and the promise of a child. Now, what's important about that is that this is the way that in In the Hebrew Bible, you live on after death. There isn't a concept of life after death in the Hebrew Bible. The Hebrew Bible is not about going to heaven when you die. In fact, that belief comes into the biblical tradition very late. In the 4 and 300s BC, when the Jews were living under Persian rule, they picked up the idea of resurrection from Zoroastrianism, the Persian religion of the time. And that belief was still controversial in the time of Jesus. If you're New Testament readers, you've heard of the two groups within Judaism, the Sadducees and the Pharisees. One of the things that separated them was belief in resurrection. The Sadducees accepted only the Torah, and because the oldest and most sacred part of the Jewish Bible. And because the idea of resurrection does not appear there, they do not accept that belief. The Pharisees accepted a larger canon, a larger list of books that they regarded as Scripture. And in some of the later ones, the idea of resurrection does appear. And so the Pharisees did believe in the resurrection of the dead. But that debate was still going on in the time of Jesus. At the time this story is being written, there is no belief in a life after death. It's like the Babylonians. If you live on at all after death, it's in Sheol, the grave, a kind of shadowy underground place. And even that only lasts as long as living people remember you. The way you live on after death in the Hebrew Bible is through your children, and particularly sons. Now, they did not use last names like we do. But in a traditional society, when a couple marries, the bride goes and lives with her husband and his family. So she becomes part of his family. And there are two relics of that in our marriage customs. One actually takes place during the wedding. The father giving away the bride. That's a leftover from a time when women were considered to be property of a man. And the father is transferring ownership from himself to his new son-in-law. Now, trust me, when 41 years ago, my father-in-law walked his daughter down the aisle and gave her to me, trust me, he and I both knew that she was nobody's property. She's as sweet as she can be, but she is independently minded, which is a polite way of saying that woman is stubborn. The other is the changing of the name. My wife was not born Laverne Hodges. She was born Laverne Foote, Foote. She's now been Laverne Hodges longer than she was Laverne Foote. Because when we got married, she was 26, I was 23. We've been married 41 years. So she's been Laverne Hodges longer than she was Laverne Foote. But the point is that a daughter doesn't continue your family. She helps somebody else continue his family. They traced ancestry through the father. And so the reason it's important to Abraham to have a son is he's getting very old, and that is the way in which he will, in a sense, live on after death. And biologically that's actually true. Our genes live on in our children. Now, the authors of the Bible had no knowledge of genetics, but there is a sense in which we do live on through our kids. But as soon as he has this child of promise, he's called on to sacrifice him. Now, when you read that story in Genesis 22, notice that it's a very sparse, matter-of-fact style of narration. It doesn't really give us much insight into what Abraham is thinking and feeling when he hears this. Did he have any questions, any doubts? And what about Isaac when he realizes what's up? We've got the fire and we've got the wood, but where's the lamb? Now, what scholars make of this is marking an end to human sacrifice. Israel's neighbors, in times at least of drought and famine, would sacrifice their children to their gods to try to appease their gods and make the famine end. What this story seems to be doing is to delegitimize that, to say, no, God does not want us to sacrifice our children. The sacrifice of animals still continues. In fact, that was the center of worship in ancient Israelite religion. But no human sacrifice. The final story I gave you is the story of Jacob and Joseph. Couple kind of general notes about that. One is, these people are really honest in telling these kind of unflattering stories about their ancestors. Because Jacob doesn't come across as a very nice guy. How he swindles his brother out of his birthright and the blessing, and then runs eventually has to deal with his father-in-law Laban, who is a kindred spirit, but I didn't give you that. I wanted you to know a little bit about the story of Jacob because it's so famous and so popular in art. I also gave you the story of Joseph for you to look at and read now, and think about that in terms of the covenant. We'll talk more about the Joseph story when we get to Islam, and we'll compare the Joseph story in the Quran with the Joseph story in Genesis. They're basically the same story, recognizably the same story, but there are a few key differences that are also important for us to look at, but we can't do that until we've read both versions. Next time we'll be looking at some of the Hebrew laws and the idea of covenant.